Hi everyone, my name is Alyssa Mialene and I am a global development reporter at Devex. We are coming to you live from New York City, where our reporters are across the UN General Assembly, the side events. We are here right now at Concordia, and I am lucky enough to be able to talk to Nicholas Kristof. Nicholas, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm delighted. I'm lucky enough to talk to Alyssa.
So Nicholas is an award-winning journalist, an author, and a New York Times columnist. And he has recently returned from the Sudan-Chad border. And given that there's so much going on in the world, and often Sudan is left from those headlines, I thought we could talk a little bit about Sudan today.
Please. It needs all the attention it can get.
Great. So tell me a little bit about your trip there, what you saw, and kind of what you came away with.
Well, it was heartbreaking, partly because I had a history of covering it. I made my first trip to Sudan back in 1984 when I was an Arabic student, and spent a lot of time there covering the Darfur genocide 20 years ago. And then that subsided, and there was real improvement. And briefly, there was a democratic government. And then in the spring of last year, the two military factions there, the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, a militia, essentially started a civil war, and the country has been in this tailspin ever since. So I was on the edge of Darfur there, and basically, so there are 2 million people who have fled the country, another 8 million displaced inside Sudan. And what they talk about is the Rapid Support Forces in particular attacking villages in ways that are very much reminiscent of what happened 20 years ago. They burn the villages, they kill the men and boys over about the age of 10, and then they rape many of the women and girls, and then people flee with nothing. And now, this has been going on for a year and a half, getting very little attention. The UN appeal for the area is less than half funded. There has not been strong pressure on countries that are providing arms to the two main sides, and famine has already been declared in one area, in Zamzam camp, and there is some talk that there will just be a catastrophic famine, maybe worse than the historic one of 1984.
So things are not good.
Things are desperate, and they may well get quite a bit worse. The Rapid Support Forces have been gaining ground on the city of El Fasher and in North Darfur, and if they seize El Fasher, then there is a lot of worry that they will engage in the same pattern of mass murder, mass rape, in ways that will just lead to a new trail of atrocities and refugees, and make everything that much worse.
Yeah, and we've been covering just all different issues surrounding Sudan closely, and something that I continue to hear from basically every organization is they can't get in. So there's been border openings and this kind of thing with peace talks, but aid is being blocked at the gates, especially for Zamzam camp, which actually was declared an area with famine in early August. Talk to me a little bit about that. I mean, did you talk to folks who were trying to get aid in, or folks who were not able to access aid? I mean, what's going on there?
So both sides have used food as a weapon of war. And in general, I'd say that the atrocities have been committed by the Rapid Support Forces have been worse, but the Sudanese Armed Forces have tried to blockade going to the RSF-controlled areas. They want to starve those areas, and so they have been reluctant to allow food in. Now, right before the rainy season began, they suddenly said, okay, temporarily you can allow food in, but that was precisely the time when it was impossible to send food in because of the rainy season. And the fear is that when it is again possible to send trucks in, they'll say, oh, time's up, now you're no longer permitted to do that. When they did allow it, the World Food Program sent 41 trucks in from Port Sudan. from the east headed west to try to relieve El Fasher and Zamzam camp. All 41 trucks are now stuck in the mud. And there are some trucks that are going in from the Chad side, but it's a logistical nightmare. They're starting in Cameroon, going through Chad, all the way across Chad, and so not much is getting in. There is a little bit of private trucks taking food in. That helps at the margin. There are some wild plants that people are eating. Again, that helps at the margin in some areas, but there is some real possibility of mass starvation of a kind we have not seen in this century, and maybe nothing since the Great Chinese Famine of the early 60s.
Yeah, and I mean, thinking about all of that, what's at stake here? It is Wednesday. We're in the middle of the UN General Assembly. I think some of your recent pieces about Sudan have pointed to the fact that there's a lot going on this week. There's a lot of world leaders here. Do you have hope that this week could change anything for Sudan? Have you seen, more effort or emphasis going toward the crisis?
There is a little bit more attention on it. Maybe, a little bit more from the General Assembly, for example. But in general, I would have to say that the world as a whole has dropped the ball on this, and that is true of just about everybody. That is true, I think, of journalism, it's true of celebrities, it's true of G7 leaders, it's true of, I think, of the Secretary General. I think it's been true of African leaders, and it's certainly true of Sudanese government, of the two main factions. There have been some heroes here, and those are Sudanese civil society. It's been magnificent. Doctors working without pay, refugees looking out after each other, teenagers who were orphaned, who were trying to help each other and working long hours to try to keep their siblings fed. So there has been some heroism, but it's all upside down. It's the people at the very bottom who have no power who are being utterly heroic, and those with power have been awful. And I don't really see that changing. I don't see a lot of evidence that there will be substantially more aid either being allowed in or being paid for to go in. I don't see signs of substantially greater pressure on the warring parties. In particular, look, United Arab Emirates is probably providing more weapons to fuel this conflict than any other party. They're supporting the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, and the leader, Mohammed bin Zayed of the UAE, met with President Biden on Monday. They issued a statement celebrating their joint attention to peace and security, and there wasn't a peep of public criticism from President Biden about the UAE's role in fueling mass murder, mass rape, mass starvation in Sudan. I think that was a real lost opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you in terms of kind of looking at, okay, what can we do? And perhaps if those in the highest levels of power are failing to put that action forward, looking deeper into communities. I mean, we've done some reporting and I've spoken to some folks who are part of the emergency response units, these local teams.
Which are magnificent.
Yeah, I mean,
they're heroic.
Heroic, absolutely heroic, and kind of really pushing into the darkest areas of this conflict and delivering this aid when most international agencies can't get it. And
right.
They're trying, but they'll be the first to tell you we're stuck. So many folks in Port Sudan and really kind of not being able to get in.
Yeah, people want to check. I think the website is mutualaidsudan.org, supporting some of these local grassroots organizations. Just incredible.
Yeah, and I mean, that being said, what can we do? I mean, we've talked about these local responders. Is there anything else the global community can or should be doing aside from continuing to put pressure or perhaps kind of continuing to speak up about Sudan? I mean, what do you think is the next option for this community really struggling?
Oh, I think that this is not inevitable. I mean, I think that if there were political will, I think that there could be better outcomes. I don't think it's inevitable that millions of people starve or massacred, driven out. And if you think 20 years ago, there was real effort to name and shame the parties that were supplying weapons to fuel the conflict. They were first an African Union and then a UN peacekeeping force sent in. There's not even serious talk about that now. So what would make a difference? It's not impossible that there would be a peace deal in which, I feel like I'm dreaming a little bit, but the two warring factions both despise each other so much that it is conceivable that a peace deal is doable in which they both retreat as long as the other one does not get an edge, and Sudan has some kind of return to civilian rule. That is essentially what the Biden administration has been pushing for with peace talks that it's led. I think that's not impossible. I do think it's quite unlikely. And I'm afraid that instead we are on a path toward a failed state, toward some kind of partition of Sudan, toward a substantial famine. But not impossible that there would be this kind of peace deal. Not impossible that the UAE would be shamed into either controlling the RSF more or providing less arms, less drone surveillance. The UAE, I spent a lot of time covering the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, and the UAE was shamed into backing out of Yemen in 2019 because of public pressure, because it just wasn't worth it for them, for the cost to their reputation. I think that if there were enough reputational cost to the UAE today, I think that they would back off from their support of the RSF or put more pressure on it to massacre fewer people. So I think we do have levers. I just don't think we've pushed them hard enough.
Yeah. And Sudan isn't the only crisis facing the world right now, right? We've got Haiti, we've got Yemen, which you rightly brought up. We've also got Afghanistan and the erosion of women's rights there. There's so much at stake right now, not to mention the climate crisis and the impacts that this is having on communities. Looking at all of that, and you as a journalist kind of being, looking and going to these places, seeing what is happening, how do we prioritize? How do we manage? How do we respond to all of these things that are facing us and our global community right now?
I really resist I'm always, when I write about one issue, people always say, oh, you should be writing instead about this or about that. And I was kind of saddened when I was writing about Sudan recently by the number of people on the right who said, oh, finally an issue that those students, university students, should be protesting about instead of Gaza. Yeah, here's a real crisis. And conversely, some on the left who were saying, what are you doing distracting from the genocide in Gaza? And please just let the poor Sudanese people get some attention that might help address their needs. And I do think that there is a fundamental problem right now that Gaza has sucked the oxygen out of coverage of every other crisis. And you mentioned Haiti, just so little attention. Myanmar is a catastrophe. Cameroon, there are just lots of them. And we do have limited bandwidth. I haven't been to Afghanistan recently, which I would, which I feel like I should be going to, but I care about all these others. And but I sort of resist the idea of a hierarchy of crises, and that Sudan is worse than Myanmar, Gaza, or something else. These are all human lives at stake, and we've got to summon the bandwidth to care about all of these.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's no easy task, but that's where we're at, right?
Yeah, we've and unfortunately, I think we're largely failing at that. And when we don't pay attention to crises, then they fester and then they get worse. And one thing I really have seen is that just the spotlight does restrain bad behavior to some degree. Back 20 years ago during the Darfur genocide, I was struck that you may remember that there was this terrible tsunami in Sri Lanka and Indonesia at that time, and that took attention off of Darfur. And then the Sudanese authorities ramped up the genocide then, because everybody was paying attention to Sri Lanka and Indonesia instead. And I do think that when the president, when the G7, when the UNSG, when others just speak out about these, when they release photos, to some degree it raises the cost of murder, of rape, of pillage. And nobody's talking about sending US troops into Sudan or something. But just because we can't do everything doesn't mean we should do nothing.